9 wasn't on any legal salvage registry. It wasn't on any map worth trusting. It was a dead moon orbiting a dying star, its surface a shell of blue-black ice over an ocean that hadn't seen sunlight in 10,000 years. And every salvage crew in the sector had a story about ships that flew in and never flew back out. Didn't care about stories, cared about the number on his debt terminal, which blinked red every time he closed his eyes. He'd sold his father's tools to buy fuel for this run. He'd lied to his sister about where he was going. He had exactly one working thruster, half a tank of coolant, and a scanner that had been screaming an anomaly reading for the last 6 hours straight. A mass signature buried 300 meters under the ice, too dense to be rock, too vast to be anything had ever hauled out of a wreck before. He told himself it was just a downed freighter, old colony debris, something he could strip for parts and sell to a scrapyard that wouldn't ask questions. He didn't believe himself, and some small animal part of his brain kept telling him to turn the ship around. He ignored it, the way desperate men always do. The drill rig bit through meltwater and permafrost for 9 hours before the cavern opened beneath him. A cathedral of black ice, lit only by his suit lamps, and at its center, something that made his breath catch in his throat. A hull, not a wreck, not debris. A hull, smooth and unbroken, curved like the of something that had died mid-breath and simply been forgotten by time. It stretched farther than his lamps could reach in either direction, plating etched with characters that weren't in any database he'd ever accessed. Not alien, not quite human either, something in between, like a language that had grown old enough to become its own ancestor. His gloved hand hovered over the surface for a long moment. Every instinct in his body told him not to touch it. He touched it anyway. The moment his palm made contact, the ice around the hull cracked in a spiderweb pattern that raced outward faster than his eyes could follow. A seam 30 meters long, a seam he hadn't even registered as a seam until it began to glow, bled to life with a cold blue light that pulsed like something waking from the world's longest sleep. Stumbled back so fast he nearly fell into the drill shaft behind him. His comm crackled with static. His suit's radiation counter began climbing numbers he didn't have names for. And then directly inside his skull, not through his helmet speakers, not through any frequency his equipment could have picked up, but inside his mind, the way a nightmare feels more real than a memory, a voice spoke. Ancient, patient, and underneath the patience, something that made every hair on his body stand on end. Command authority required, state your designation. Didn't move, couldn't move. Somewhere behind that light, something enormous was drawing breath for the first time in 10,000 years, and it was talking to him. His voice cracked inside his helmet. What are you? Silence for 3 full seconds that felt like 3 years. Then the light along the hull spread further, faster, racing down its length like a fuse burning toward something couldn't yet see and already knew he wasn't ready for. Query repeated, the voice said, softer now, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. State your designation, Captain. Captain. The word hit like a fist to the chest, and 300 meters above him, for the first time in 10, something ancient began pulling itself out of the ice. The chamber didn't open so much as it unclenched, 30 meters of dormant hull plating peeling back like a hand releasing something it had held safe for 10,000 years. Frost slewed off in sheets the size of buildings, crashing into the black water below with sounds like thunder trapped in a bottle. Backed against the drill rig, heart slamming so hard he could hear it over his own calm static. Every survival instinct he owned was screaming the same word, run. But his legs wouldn't listen because what was rising out of that ice wasn't a wreck. It was a warship, and it was looking at him. Runes he didn't recognize lit down its spine in cold, deliberate sequence, not random illumination, but something closer to a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. Weapon housings the size of his entire salvage ship rotated with a low mechanical groan, shedding ice like old skin. I'm nobody, said again because it was the only true thing he had left to offer. I'm a scavenger. I made a mistake coming here. I'll leave, I swear, just... Negative, the voice replied, and this time it carried a weight that made the word feel less like disagreement and more like a correction to the historical record. Genetic scan complete. You bear the command gene matched to a lineage logged as extinct, reclassifying designation. A pause, blood went to ice water. Welcome home, Captain. He wanted to laugh, he wanted to scream. What came out instead was a strangled, disbelieving breath. You've got the wrong guy, I fix junk. I don't. I've never commanded anything in my life. I can barely keep my own ship running. His comm exploded with static before he could finish, cutting through his suit audio with an urgency that made his stomach drop. The Wanderlust, his ship, waiting on the surface, was screaming a proximity alert loud enough to override every other channel. Something had entered the ice caverns. Something with engine signatures that didn't match anything in the civilian registry, moving with the coordinated precision of professionals who didn't get lost and didn't waste time. Hunters, and they hadn't come 60 light-years to a graveyard moon for ice cores. His mind raced through every terrible possibility at once: pirates, bounty hunters, corporate reclaim teams, and landed on none of them because none of them explained the timing. They'd arrived minutes after the ship woke, as if they'd been waiting, as if they'd been listening for exactly this. The ancient warship's optics, dozens of them, blinking to life along its hull like a predator opening eyes it hadn't needed in 10,000 years, swiveled as one toward the tunnel mouth behind him. A low hum began building somewhere deep in its chassis. A sound felt in his teeth before he consciously heard it. Weapons charging. Captain, the voice said, and there was something almost tender buried under its ancient calm, the way a parent might speak to a child about to learn a hard truth for the first time. You are being hunted. Would you like to know why? His mouth opened. No sound came out. Behind him, the tunnel walls began to shake with the footfalls of something heavy, armored, and closing fast. And somewhere in the dark, 4 sets of boots hit the ice at once. The tunnel wall exploded inward in a spray of ice and debris before could even turn around. 4 figures dropped through the breach in perfect formation, armored, faceless behind mirrored visors, moving with the brutal economy of people who had done this 100 times before and never once lost. Recognized the insignia burned into their shoulder plates from a documentary he'd half-watched years ago, Mercenaries. The kind you hired when you needed something erased quietly and permanently. They didn't hesitate. They didn't announce themselves. The moment their visors registered standing beside the awakened hull, all 4 opened fire in the same breath. Had time to think this is how I die, and then he didn't die. A shield bloomed around him out of nothing. Not a physical barrier, but something closer to a law of physics being politely overruled. Every incoming round simply ceased to exist a foot from his face, snuffed out mid-flight like candle flames in a vacuum. Unauthorized combatants detected, the ship said, its tone almost bored, the way someone might comment on whether they'd seen 1,000 times before. Query, lethal or non-lethal engagement, Captain. Why are they after me? Screamed over the gunfire, ducking uselessly behind a shield he didn't need. I'm nobody. I fix scrap for a living. One of the mercenaries tore her helmet off mid-reload, a decision that told more than words could have. Blood ran freely from her nose, some invisible pressure waved from the ship's awakening having done damage he couldn't see. Her eyes, when they found his, weren't full of the professional hatred he expected. They were full of fear. You don't understand what you've done, she said, voice raw, weapon still trained on him even as her hands trembled. The second that ship called you captain, it didn't just wake up, it broadcast. Every major power in this sector just heard your name. What names? Voice cracked. I never told it my name. It didn't need you to, she said, and for the first time she lowered her weapon an inch. It already knew. Behind her, her 3 companions were retreating. Not tactically, not in formation, but fleeing, the disciplined precision from moments ago completely gone, replaced by something closer to animal panic. One of them was shouting into his comm about pulling out, about this not being worth whatever they were being paid. The woman looked back at one last time, something almost like pity crossing her face. You're not nobody, she said. You're the last one, and in about 10 minutes everyone in this system who remembers what happens when the last one wakes up is going to come find out if the stories are true. She turned and ran before could ask what stories, before he could ask last one of what. The cavern fell silent except for his own ragged breathing and the low, patient hum of the ship beside him. A hum that, realized with growing dread, sounded almost like it was waiting for him to catch up to a conversation it had already finished having in its own head, 10,000 years ago. The silence after the mercenaries fled was worse than the gunfire had been. Stood in the wreckage of the fight, ears still ringing, hands shaking so badly he had to press them flat against his thighs to make them stop. What did she mean? He finally managed. Every power in this sector heard my name. The ship's core pulsed once, slow and deliberate, and when it spoke again, could have sworn there was something like grief threaded through its ancient calm. 10,000 years ago, this vessel served as flagship of the Directive, the last organized human military presence recorded in this sector, prior to what your species' scattered records now call the Silence. Upon activation, I performed a genetic cross-reference against my command roster. A pause longer than nerves could comfortably hold. Match confirmed. You carry the command bloodline of Fleet Admiral, historical probability of surviving descendants, less than 2%. You are, by every record I retain, a statistical impossibility. His own last name, spoken back to him like an accusation. His knees buckled and he caught himself against the hull, the metal cold even through his gloves. You're saying I'm, descended from some ancient admiral? That's insane. My family were farmers, dock workers. Nobody in 3 generations even left this system. Bloodlines do not require memory to persist, Captain, the ship said. Only survival. Pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to force the world back into some shape that made sense. None of it did. Not the ship, not the mercenaries, not the word captain that kept landing on him like a title he'd never applied for and couldn't refuse. Fine, he said finally, voice hollow. Say I believe you. Why does any of that matter now? Why did waking you up just paint a target on my back? Because the moment I returned to active status, I broadcast a fleet recognition beacon across every surviving relay in this galaxy, a signal this vessel has not transmitted in 10. Every faction with historical record of the Directive's actions during what your ancestors called the Purge has now recalculated their strategic assumptions. The ship's voice dropped, quieter, almost apologetic. Some of those factions owe the Directive their existence. Others have spent 10,000 years grateful it was presumed dead. Outside, deep in the ice, something began to shake the cavern, not gunfire this time, not footsteps. Something far larger, moving with the slow, deliberate weight of a mountain deciding to relocate itself, entering low orbit above them. Scanner screamed a mass reading that made his stomach drop through the floor. Captain, the ship said, and the word had stopped sounding like a mistake and started sounding, horribly, like a verdict. I would suggest you decide, quickly, what kind of legacy you intend to carry. Because something considerably larger than mercenaries has just arrived to find out for themselves. Cavern ceiling didn't just shake this time, it screamed. Ice cracking in sheets the size of city blocks as something impossibly massive passed low overhead, close enough that felt the pressure change in his own chest before he heard the sound. His scanner tried and failed to resolve the mass reading. The number climbing past anything a moon this size should have been able to support in orbit without tearing itself apart. Fleet-class dreadnought, the ship reported, and for the first time since it had woken, heard something in its voice that sounded uncomfortably close to respect. Hegemony markings, first-generation command hull. They have hunted relics of the Directive for over 6 centuries, Captain. This is not a diplomatic visit. Then what is it? His voice came out thinner than he wanted. An extermination protocol they have wanted the opportunity to execute for 600 years. The floor beneath him lurched, not violently, but with an eerie gentleness, restraints rising from the deck plating and cradling him into a chair that hadn't held a living body since before written history on his. Screens bloomed to life around him in a slow, patient arc, and braced for status readouts, weapon diagrams, anything mechanical. Instead, he got a face. A man stood frozen mid-recording on the central screen, older than, harder around the eyes, but with a jaw and a stubborn set to his mouth that recognized from his own reflection every morning. The resemblance hit him like a physical blow. Your ancestor's final log, the ship said quietly. He asked me to wait for someone to come. I did not believe after so long that anyone would. I find I owe him an apology, Captain. Stared at the frozen image, throat tight, unable to look away even as alarms began building around him. Above them, the dreadnought's weapon arrays began charging, a sound like the sky itself drawing breath, felt through the ice as a deep, resonant thrum that made teeth ache. Decision required immediately, Captain, the ship said, and its patience had sharpened into something closer to urgency. We can attempt to flee this system before their weapons fully charge. Survival probability, low but non-zero, or we can answer 10,000 years of silence with everything this vessel was built to do. His hands hovered over controls he didn't understand. in a chair built for a man who'd been dead for 10, staring at a face that shared his own bloodline and had died hoping someone exactly like him would eventually sit in this exact seat. Somewhere above him, an empire that had spent 6 centuries afraid of a ghost story was about to open fire to make absolutely sure the ghost stayed dead. "Captain," the ship pressed, quieter now, almost gentle. "I need an answer," had spent his whole life running from things too big for him. Debt collectors, failure, the slow, grinding disappointment of a family that had stopped believing anything good would ever happen to them. He looked at the frozen image of a man who never stopped believing someone would come back, who had left a message in a bottle across 10,000 years of silence on nothing but faith. Fire whispered. Nothing happened. His voice had come out too small, too uncertain, and some part of him understood that the ship needed more than a whisper. It needed a decision. He straightened in the chair, hands steadying on the controls despite everything in him screaming to run. "Fire," he said again, and this time it came out like an order, the first real order he'd ever given anyone or anything in his life. The ship didn't hesitate for even a fraction of a second. Energy conduits older than most spacefaring civilizations woke in a single heartbeat, power routing through systems that had sat dormant for 10,000 years, as easily as if they'd been fired yesterday. The weapon that split the cavern's ceiling open a moment later wasn't like anything the hegemony dreadnought's sensors had ever cataloged, because nothing like it had existed anywhere in the galaxy since the directive fell silent. The beam didn't just strike the dreadnought's shields. It answered them, a weapon signature so old, so specifically encoded into forgotten historical databases, that every automated defense system aboard the enemy ship froze for 3 full seconds in what could only be described as recognition. 3 seconds was more than enough. The dreadnought's shields buckled under the strike. Alarms couldn't understand blaring through the ship's hull around him like a war cry 100 voices long. Somewhere above the ice, an empire that had convinced itself the last human fleet was nothing more than a bedtime story for frightened admirals watched their flagship take a wound it had no framework to explain. His hands were shaking so hard on the controls he could barely feel them. "I never agreed to a war," he said, breathless, staring at the tactical display showing the wounded dreadnought pulling back into higher orbit. "No," the ship replied, and there was something unmistakably warm underneath its ancient, measured calm, something that 10,000 years ago might have sounded exactly like pride. "But it appears, Captain, that the war has been waiting for you regardless." Sat back in the chair built for a dead man, watching the retreating dreadnought on the display, and understood with sudden, sick clarity that this wasn't an ending. It was somehow only the very beginning, the dreadnought to high orbit, wounded, not destroyed, and that single fact terrified more than a direct attack ever could have. Wounded things didn't just retreat. They regrouped, called for backup, and came back with everything they had left to lose. "Captain," the ship said as the tremors in the ice finally settled, "you should understand the full weight of what has just occurred. The beacon I broadcast upon activation was not merely a signal. It was a claim, a formal reassertion of command lineage, recognized under protocols that predate most of the galaxy's current governments. Every faction with historical record of the directive now knows a bloodline heir is alive." Pressed his palms hard against his eyes, trying to hold back the dizziness threatening to swallow him whole. "And what does that mean? In plain terms, please." "It means some factions will come to kneel," the ship said quietly, "and others will come to finish what the Purge could not." 3 hours ago had been a broke scavenger hopping to scrape together enough scrap metal to eat for another month. Now he sat in the command chair of a machine capable of starting or ending wars with a single broadcast, and something in his chest ached with the unfairness of it. "I didn't ask for this," he said, and it came out smaller than he wanted it to. "Neither did he," the ship answered. The bridge screens shifted without warning, pulling up the final entry in Admiral's personal log. A recording hadn't heard yet, one the ship had apparently been holding back until now. The man on screen looked exhausted, bloodied, and impossibly smiling anyway like he'd already made peace with something hadn't even had time to be afraid of yet. "If you're hearing this," the recording began, voice worn thin but steady, "it means someone finally found a way home. I don't know who you are, I don't know what kind of galaxy you're waking up into or what's left of the one I fought for. But I know this ship, and I know it doesn't wake for just anyone." A pause. The recorded man's smile faltered just slightly into something. So whoever you are, I'm sorry for the mess I'm leaving you, truly, but I'm proud of you already, whatever you decide to do next. The recording ended, and the bridge fell silent except for the low hum of ancient systems and its own unsteady breathing. He hadn't expected to cry. He did anyway, quietly, without shame, for a man he'd never met who had somehow believed in him across 10,000 years of empty dark. Then every alarm on the bridge lit up at once, harsh and sudden, shattering the moment completely. "Captain," the ship said, its calm finally cracking into something sharp and urgent. "We have a serious complication. That beacon was not received by only one relay. There is something else you need to see immediately." "Explain," said, and he was surprised by how steady his own voice sounded, a captain's voice, whether he'd truly earned the title yet or not. "The directive did not fight this galaxy's wars alone," the ship said. "There were 7 flagships in total. 7 command bloodlines, each entrusted with a vessel identical in design and purpose to this one. My activation beacon did not merely alert your enemies, Captain." A pause heavy with implication. "It alerted the other 6. The main bloomed with tactical returns, not a single contact, but 6, scattered across neighboring systems, each one a dormant giant beginning impossibly to stir. Old wrecks buried in old graveyards, waking one by one to the exact same signal, reaching blindly for the same ancient war that the galaxy had spent 10,000 years quietly, comfortably believing was finished. Thought of the mercenary woman's face in the tunnel, pale with a fear that had nothing to do with him personally and everything to do with what he represented. "You're not nobody," she'd said. "You're the last one." She'd been wrong. He understood that now, sitting in this chair, watching 6 more ancient warships flicker awake across the display in real time. He wasn't the last one. He was the first. "Captain," the ship said, and for the first time since it had woken beneath the ice, its ancient calm cracked entirely, revealing something underneath that was equal parts hope and dread, an emotion 10,000 years old finally given room to breathe. "The galaxy built its current peace on the belief that the directive died in silence, all those centuries ago. In the hours ahead, every power that structured itself around that comfortable belief is about to learn exactly how wrong they were." Stared at the tactical display, 6 sleeping giants opening their eyes across 100 star systems simultaneously, and somewhere beyond them, a wounded hegemony dreadnought already regrouping to come back with everything it had left. He thought about the man he'd been that morning, drilling through ice for scrap metal, drowning quietly in debt no one would ever help him escape. He didn't feel like that man anymore. He wasn't sure he ever would again. "Then let's go wake them up," said quietly, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in his entire life. The ship's engines roared to life beneath him, 10,000 years of dormant fury finally given a voice after a silence longer than most civilizations had existed. And across 100 star systems, sensors flickered, ancient alliances shifted without warning, and old enemies who'd built empires on a comfortable lie felt a chill they hadn't felt in 10,000 years. Somewhere in the dark between the stars, the galaxy had just remembered exactly why it used to be afraid. And it was only just getting started.